Hello, my friends. This is Mark Levin. Our number, 877-381-3811. 877-381-3811. You know, the media in this great country owe the American people an apology. And they owe the American people a lot more than the American people are getting from the media. The media continually fail this great nation. They continually, fail to get to the meat of matters and get the facts out. The media in this country are not only biased, they're superficial. These events in Egypt have been going on for 18 days. They've been going on longer, but in the streets, in the open, 18 days. And you cannot find a mainstream media news report breaking down exactly who it is in the streets and exactly who it is who's been organizing them. The best information comes from bloggers on the scene, or bloggers in the region. But if you listen to ABC News during this broadcast, or NBC News, or CBS, or you listen to the cables, you'll have no idea, and you haven't had any idea. But one thing you do know from the media coverage, as superficial as it is that they're cheering on these events. They think these events are wonderful. Because the media have no obligation to anybody, particularly the American media in Egypt, or reporting from afar. This doesn't directly affect any of them. And rather than admit that they have few sources and little information beyond the superficial, that is, interviewing a few people on the street, they keep reporting the same thing day in and day out, day in and day out. The people got what they wanted, this is a democracy movement, and so forth. The media were all excited during the 1979, it's really a few years before that, 77 to 79 revolution in Iran. They couldn't wait for the Shah to go either. And he left. Eventually, Khomeini took over. Eventually, he executed 30,000 political prisoners, including former groups that were allied with him. See, folks, once all the emotion is over and the governing begins, whenever that is, the consequences kick in. You have this big emotional spasm, and then things sort themselves out. But our media, they won't sort anything out. Mubarak has stepped down. He's been replaced by a council of Mubaraks. Mubarak was a general. He's been replaced by a council of generals. Everybody's saying it's great that the Army's in charge now. The Army was in charge under Mubarak. He was the Army. He was part of the Army. I've been saying from day one, nobody knows how this is going to end, and nobody does, which is why I don't support mass movements, and I don't become a true believer to mass movements if I'm not sure who is behind them and where they're headed. It is completely irresponsible. A good friend of mine quoted Thomas Paine. My friend who quoted Thomas Paine is a Burkean, for those of you who care. Stunning, because Thomas Paine relentlessly attacked Edmund Burke. He ran off to France to join the French Revolution, and then Franklin and Jefferson had to beg the revolutionaries to let him out of jail and bring him back. In other words, Paine was good for the American Revolution, but he got carried away with himself. Now, I want to get back to the media in our great country. The media have become part of the problem. They become part of the problem in how they report domestic events and clearly now foreign events. Jack Castro wrote a piece in WorldNet Daily several years ago about the New York Times coverage of Fidel Castro. And I want to remind you about this. He points out that New York Times correspondent Herbert Mathews was the key reporter and editorialist for the New York Times who was promoting Castro and that revolution. He writes, in February 1957, only 2 months after landing a small force on Cuba, the beleaguered young rebel leader Fidel Castro had sent for a foreign journalist, any journalist, to counter the rumor that he'd been killed upon landing. As the story goes, one almost too fortuitous to be believed, his men stumbled upon Mathews, a veteran Times reporter, Herbert Mathews. Castro biographer Georgie Ann Geyer calls Mathews, quote, the right person at the right moment, unquote. A hopeless romantic and a committed liberal by his own description, Mathews was looking to rekindle the revolutionary spirit. that seemed so much alive in the world of his youth. In Castro, he found that spirit's embodiment. Quote, taking him as one would at first, by physique and personality, wrote Mathews in the critical first article, this was quite a man, a powerful 6-footer, olive-skinned, full-faced, with a straggly beard. Although he would never admit it, Mathews was serving as an audience of one in an absurdist guerrilla theater. Castro had fully stage-managed this meeting. He circulated his men through the camp and took, quote, reports, unquote, from other distant, quote, columns, unquote, columns of revolutionaries in Mathews' presence. As a result, Mathews convinced himself that there were at least 40 fighters in this camp and many more deep in the mountains. Quote, the most dangerous enemy General Batista has yet to face, he wrote. In fact, Castro had 18 fighters in his ragtag band, but not for long. His force would start growing when he made his heroic debut a week later on the front page of the New York Times. Mathews thought he was in a jungle, writes Geyer, and in truth he was, a jungle of obfuscation and deliberate deceit. For Castro, deceiving Mathews about the scope of his ambitions proved even easier than deceiving him about the size and strength of his force. His February 24, 1957 report in the New York Times was all Castro could hope for and more. After much breastbeating about how he alone had gotten to see this flaming symbol of the revolution, Mathews addresses the critical question of Castro's intentions. He wrote, quote, the program is vague and couched in generalities, writes Mathews, but it amounts to a new deal for Cuba, radical democratic and therefore anti-communist, quote unquote. His claim that Castro was anti-communist suggests that at best Mathews had been hoaxed. Castro's two closest confidants, his brother Raul and Ernesto Che Guevara, were communists from day one. In 1957, the same year as the Mathews interview, Guevara wrote to a friend, quote, my ideological training means that I am one of those people who believe that the solution to the world's problems is to be found behind the Iron Curtain, unquote. There could be no greater proof of Che's love for Lenin than the fact that he named his son Vladimir. It is impossible to believe that Raul Castro and Guevara did not influence Fidel in both style and substance. Guevara had been with Castro since 1955. As a commander of a detachment, he had a reputation for ruthlessness. On one occasion, he had a child shot to death without trial for stealing a little food. He was captured and executed during his futile effort to spread the Marxist-Leninist gospel to an unappreciative Bolivia. Now, Mathews missed all of this, and not just in 1957. Che Guevara, he would write 4 years after Che's death, was one of those people who bolsters a man's faith in the human race, unquote. So as Castro began his 2-year march on Havana, the favored Mathews saw no sign of the Marxist revolution to come. He has strong ideas of liberty, democracy, social justice, the need to restore the constitutions, Mathews wrote of Castro in that pivotal 1957 New York Times article. Disarmed by Mathews' authoritative reports, the CIA and the U.S. Department of State offered no resistance. When Castro and his men did arrive, they wasted little time disabusing their supporters any hopes they might have had for a constitutional democracy. They summarily executed 600 Batista supporters within the first 5 months, often after carnival-like show trials in an open-air stadium. They radicalized the agrarian reform program and started seizing estates. They shut down the independent newspapers. They organized an extensive intelligence service with watches in every neighborhood. They savagely oppressed homosexuals. And, of course, they indefinitely canceled elections. All of this within 2 years of taking power. By the end of the decade, the Castro government had executed between 7,000 and 10,000 political opponents, imprisoned 30,000 more, driven several hundred thousands into exile, many of whom drowned at sea. Regardless of these abuses, New York Times reporter Mathews, writing at the end of that same decade, remained convinced that Castro's, quote, solid virtues and ideals far outweigh the weaknesses, unquote. In his 1964 book, Cuba, something of a primer on the island's history, Mathews acknowledges that Castro may have used the wrong means, quote unquote. He balances that, however, by speaking of Castro's eagerness to, quote, do what is best for Cuba and the Cuban people. Castro has, after all, made life for Cuban children more exciting and the distribution of wealth more equal, he wrote. His government has gone wrong and is largely a matter of youthful inexperience and amateurness. In Mathews' eyes, when all is said and done, Castro stands as one of the most extraordinary men of our times. And so it is, ladies and gentlemen, that we get romanticized reporting from our reporters in Egypt. So it is, as the State Department and the CIA looked the other way when Castro was ascending, with the head of all of our intelligence agencies yesterday in front of a committee of Congress telling them and the whole world that the Muslim Brotherhood is secular and does not seek violence. So it is that the same media industrial complex that has covered this event in Egypt, and still will, and covered what went on in Cuba, covered the events that took place in Iran prior to the ascendancy of the Islamo-Nazi regime there, rooting all the way for the elimination of the Shah and this exciting new democratic movement in Iran. We'll be right back. Now in New York City that is, Astoria, Queens, New York, there's this fairly significant Egyptian population. And WABC Channel 7 was there during the reporting that Mubarak had stepped down. And the lady reporting, notice she's a local reporter who's not in Egypt. She's in Astoria, Queens. There's a big difference. And while she's reporting, I want you to listen to the man yelling in the background. This is Stacy Sager. Go.
We do catch a glimpse of why some people may be most afraid.
Jordan is next, and Israel is out. Jordan is next, and Israel out.
Jordan is next, and Israel is out. That's what he said. Oh, it's spreading, the democracy movement. I'm watching a lot of people struggle with the notion that Marxists, socialists, and young idealists indoctrinated by their professors could combine with the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamo-Nazis. How could it be, they wonder? Must be John Bircher type conspiracy thinking. And yet it's what happens, isn't it? Happened in Iran. It's happening in Egypt. Happens all the time. Let me help them out. The Marxists, the socialists, the Nimrods who are persuaded by their professors, Muslim Brotherhood and so forth, what do they all have in common? They all reject individual liberty, don't they? The difference is the Islamo-Nazis believe in a religion imposed on the earth. The Marxists believe in a secular religion imposed on the earth. But they all destroy the individual. We'll be right back.
We do catch a glimpse of why some people may be most afraid.
Jordan is next, and Israel is out. Jordan is next, and Israel out.
Jordan and Nick, get it out. That gentleman's in America. That's WABC Channel 7. Yes. Barack Obama is very supportive of this revolution. Isn't he making a real schmuck out of himself, by the way? I mean, it's embarrassing. As an American, I'm embarrassed by this. But let's get cut 7 ready, Mr. Producer. I want you to hear what he has to say about the revolutionaries, the young people, he calls them. And by the way, on one hand I hear all walks of life, the old, the young, the women, the men, the this, the that, and then I keep hearing, it's the young people. I mean, we don't even know who's in the crowd even. But I want you to listen to this. This is Obama, cut 7, talking about a protest. Go.
I do think that what has happened is layered on top of some of that general frustration that has expressed itself through the Tea Party. There is an awful lot of corporate money that's pouring into these elections right now. You've got tens of millions of dollars in what are called third-party expenditures that are being spent basically on negative ads.
Oh, excuse me. So there's a problem with the Tea Party. They're bought off. And, of course, all this corporate money in our elections. But he's backing the Muslim Brotherhood, whatever the hell's going on in Egypt. He's all for that. Our system sucks. Our people sucks. Whatever they are, who they are, whatever they're doing, great. Great.